The first light of dawn painted the peaks of Pine Brook Ridge in shades of amber and rose, casting long shadows across the valley floor. The morning mist clung to the pine trees like ghostly fingers, lingering in the cool, crisp air. George Whitaker stood on his weathered porch, cradling a steaming mug of black coffee between his calloused hands, a comforting ritual he had kept for 8 years. The silence around him was profound, settling deep into his bones, a silence that either comforted or haunted a man, depending on the ghosts he carried. For George, at 62, the quiet had become his refuge. It was honest, unlike the chaos that had filled the years of his life before. The war had taken from him more than just his health, leaving behind scars deeper than the shrapnel marks across his left shoulder. There were things it had taken that could never return. But on mornings like this, with the cool Colorado air filling his lungs, he could almost forget the weight of those memories. Ranger lay stretched out on the porch, his graying muzzle resting on massive paws. At 12 years old, the German Shepherd was no stranger to hardship. His body carried the marks of countless years of service, both visible and hidden deep within his intelligent brown eyes. Years spent in search and rescue had sharpened Ranger's instincts so deeply that not even retirement could quiet them. Even as he lay still, his ears were always alert, every muscle prepared to spring into action. Suddenly, the quiet was broken by a harsh metallic screech, followed by the unmistakable crash of metal on metal. The sound was enough to send birds flying out of the trees in a wild, panicked frenzy. George's coffee mug slipped from his hands, shattering on the porch steps as his body dropped instinctively into a crouch. For a moment, he was back in Afghanistan, hearing the shrill whistle of incoming artillery. Ranger was already on his feet, every muscle tense, his eyes fixed on the forest. "Easy, boy," George muttered, forcing himself to stand. He looked out over the valley. Probably just another derailment. But Ranger wasn't listening. The dog's body quivered with purpose, his gaze locked on the pine grove behind their property. Without hesitation, Ranger bounded off the porch, leaping over the split-rail fence with surprising agility, disappearing into the trees. "Ranger!" George shouted, but his voice was lost in the forest. For a moment, George stood frozen, torn, between the comfort of his porch and the growing certainty that something significant had just happened. The old dog had never run off like that before, not once in all their years together. Cursing under his breath, George grabbed his jacket and followed, his boots crunching through the layer of pine needles and remnants of early spring snow that still lingered in the shaded areas. The trees grew denser as George ventured deeper into the forest, their branches forming a canopy above, filtering the morning light into patterns of shifting gold and green. After what felt like an eternity, he found Ranger about a quarter-mile in, near a rocky outcrop where a seasonal creek carved its way down the mountainside. The dog was motionless, his posture rigid with focus. This wasn't the usual stance of a dog casually sniffing about. This was Ranger in full rescue mode. George approached cautiously, his senses sharpening as he took in the scene. Splintered wood scattered across the forest floor, torn canvas, metal clasps bent at unnatural angles. The remains of a freight crate, crushed beyond recognition. And then, half hidden in the shadow of the rocks, George saw what had caught Ranger's attention. A small bear cub, no more than 20 pounds, lay tangled in the wreckage. Its dark fur was matted with mud and debris from its tumble down the mountainside. The cub's hind legs were bound by thick rope, cutting into its tender flesh, and a faded red cloth was tied around its neck, a cruel makeshift collar. The little bear was conscious, its dark eyes wide with fear, but it barely moved. The terror reflected in its eyes seemed far too old for such a young creature. Ranger crouched beside the cub, gently licking the mud from its face. The cub didn't pull away or lash out. Whether from exhaustion, injury, or some instinctive recognition that the dog meant no harm, it remained still. George watched in silence, struck by the tenderness of the moment. This wasn't just a rescue. It was something more. "What have we here?" George whispered as he knelt beside them. The cub's eyes met his, filled with fear, but there was something else, something that spoke of resilience, of a will to survive. George had seen enough of the world to recognize the signs of illegal wildlife trafficking. The rope, the makeshift collar, And the way the cub had been transported, none of it was legal or humane. Someone had stolen this bear cub from its family, and fate had intervened in the form of a derailment and a retired rescue dog with instincts that wouldn't quit. "It's okay, little one," George muttered softly, unsure if he was speaking to the cub or to himself. "Nobody's going to hurt you now." Ranger looked up at him then, and in the dog's intelligent eyes, George saw something that hit him like a wave of understanding, a soldier's resolve. Ranger's gaze seemed to say, "This one is ours. We save this one." George carefully untangled the ropes from the cub's legs, wincing as the little bear whimpered in pain, but it didn't struggle. When George gently lifted it into his arms, the cub trembled against his chest. The walk back to the house was silent, almost surreal. Ranger trotted beside them, never straying far. George found himself remembering a time long ago when he had carried a wounded soldier through enemy lines, the weight of the man in his arms pressing heavily. The situation had been different, but the underlying truth was the same. Sometimes you carry someone not because you have to, but because you can't live with yourself if you don't. Inside, Martha was kneading bread dough in the kitchen, her silver hair pulled back into the same simple bun she had worn for years. She looked up when she heard footsteps and froze when she saw what George was carrying. Her mouth opened in surprise. "George, what in heaven's name?" she gasped. "I found him in the woods," George said simply, setting the cub gently on the kitchen table. "He fell off a freight train. Looks like someone was transporting him illegally." Martha's heart tightened as she looked at the cub, taking in its injuries, the raw rope burns, the makeshift collar, the trembling. For a long moment, she stood still, staring at the little bear. Her heart broke for it, but at the same time, something inside her shifted. Her maternal instincts, buried deep since the miscarriage that had stolen their dreams of having children, began to stir. "You poor thing," she whispered, her voice full of compassion. "We can't keep him," she said, her tone full of uncertainty. "Can't exactly call animal control," George replied, his voice steady. "Not without raising too many questions. And look at him, Martha. Look at what they did to him." Just then, the cub let out a small sound, a whimper, part cry, part plea. The sound seemed to break through Martha's defenses, and her resolve crumbled completely. "He needs a name," she said quietly. "Milo," George said without hesitation. The name appeared in his mind, as if it had always been there. "His name is Milo." And so began a new chapter in the Whitaker family's life. One they hadn't expected, but one they would not regret. The first few days passed in a blur of care and recovery. Milo was weak from his ordeal, requiring constant attention. Martha threw herself into his care, researching bear cub nutrition and learning what he needed to thrive. Ranger took on the role of protector, never leaving Milo's side. The old dog's instincts told him that the cub needed more than just food and shelter. He needed to learn to trust again. The bond between them was evident to George, who couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder at how healing could come from the most unexpected of places. Milo's fear was deep, and every loud sound, a car backfiring, a door slamming, even a microwave beep, would send him cowering into a corner. Ranger, ever patient, would position himself between Milo and the source of the fear. The dog would stand firm, acting as a shield, and make soft, reassuring noises that calmed the cub. It was during one of these moments that George realized the depth of Milo's trauma. The cub wasn't just reacting to sounds, he was reacting to memories, memories of his family being taken from him. Somewhere, in the depths of the cub's mind, the past played on a loop. "I know what it's like," George said quietly one evening, sitting beside Milo, who trembled in fear. "Being the one who got away. Wondering why you survived when others didn't." Milo's dark eyes met his, full of understanding. George reached out slowly, letting the cub sniff his fingers before gently stroking the soft fur behind one ear. "You're safe now," George whispered. "We're going to figure this out together."